to me as though just the smell of Persia would be able to drive away even the memory of red plush dust and scorching woodwork. And there was a man on the steamer whom I used to know at home, a man who's almost always wanted to marry me, and there was a man who joined our party at Teheran who liked me a little, and the land was like silk and silver and attar of roses. But all the time I couldn't seem to think about anything except how perfectly awful it was that a stranger like me should be running around loose in the world, carrying all the big, scary secrets of a man who didn't even know where I was. And then it came to me all of a sudden, one rather worrisome day, that no woman who knew as much about a man as I did was exactly a stranger to him. And then twice as suddenly to great grown up, cool blooded, money staled, book tamed me, it swept over me like a cyclone that I should never be able to decide anything more in all my life, not the width of a tinsel ribbon, not the goal of a journey, not the worth of a lover, until I'd seen the face that belonged to the voice in the railroad wreck. And I sat down and wrote the man a letter. I had his name and address, you know. And there in a rather maddening moonlight night on the Caspian Sea, all the horrors and terrors of that other Canadian night came back to me and swamped completely all the arid timidity and sleek conventionality that women like me are hidebound with all their lives, and I wrote him, that unknown, unvisualized, unimagined man, the utterly free, utterly frank, utterly honest sort of letter that any brave soul would write any other brave soul every day of the world if there wasn't any flesh. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even a sentimental letter. Never mind what I told him. Never mind anything except that there in that tropical night, on a moonlit sea, I asked him to meet me here in Boston, 8 months afterward, on the same Boston bound Canadian train, on this, the anniversary of our other tragic meeting. "And you think he'll be at the station?" gasped the Traveling Salesman. The Youngish Girl's answer was astonishingly tranquil. "I don't know, I'm sure," she said. "That part of it isn't my business. All I know is that I wrote the letter and mailed it. It's Fate's move next." "But maybe he never got the letter," protested the Traveling Salesman, buckling frantically at the straps of his sample case. "Very likely," the Youngish Girl answered calmly. "And if he never got it, then Fate has surely settled everything perfectly definitely for me that way. The only trouble with that would be," she added whimsically, "that an unanswered letter is always pretty much like an unhooked hook. Any kind of a gap is apt to be awkward, and the hook that doesn't catch in its own intended tissue is mighty apt to tear later at something you didn't want torn." "I don't know anything about that," persisted the Traveling Salesman, brushing nervously at the cinders on his hat. "All I say is maybe he's married." "Well, that's all right," smiled the Youngish Girl. "Then Fate would have settled it all for me perfectly satisfactorily that way. I wouldn't mind at all his not being at a station. And I wouldn't mind at all his being married. And I wouldn't mind at all his turning out to be very, very old. None of those things, you see, would interfere in the slightest with the memory of the voice or the chivalry of the broken hand. The only thing I'd mind, I tell you, would be to think that he really and truly was the man who was made for me, and I missed finding it out. Oh, of course, I've worried myself sick these past few months, thinking of the audacity of what I've done. I've got such a sore thought, as you call it, that I'm almost ready to scream if anybody mentions the word indiscreet in my presence. And yet, after all, it isn't as though I were reaching out into the darkness after an indefinite object. What I'm reaching out for is a light, so that I can tell exactly just what object is there. And anyway," she quoted a little waveringly, "he either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small, who dares not put it to the touch to gain or lose at all." "Ain't you scared just a little bit?" probed the Traveling Salesman. All around them the people began bustling suddenly with their coats and bags. With a gesture of impatience the Youngish Girl jumped up and started to fasten her furs. The eyes that turned to answer the Traveling Salesman's question were brimming wet with tears. "Yes, I'm scared to death." She smiled incongruously. Almost authoritatively the Salesman reached out his empty hand for her traveling bag. "What you going to do if he ain't there?" he asked. The girl's eyebrows lifted. "Why, just what I'm going to do if he is there," she answered quite definitely. "I'm going right back to Montreal to-night. There's a train out again, I think, at 8:30. Even late as we are, that will give me an hour and a half at the station." "Gee!" said the Traveling Salesman. "And you traveled 5 days just to see what a man looks like for an hour and a half?" "I'd have traveled twice 5 days," she whispered, "just to see what he looked like for a second and a half." "But how in thunder are you going to recognize him?" fussed the Traveling Salesman. "And how in thunder is he going to recognize you?" "Maybe I won't recognize him," acknowledged the Youngish Girl. "And likelier than not he won't recognize me. But don't you see? Can't you understand that all the audacity of it, all the worry of it, is absolutely nothing compared to the one little chance in 10,000 that we will recognize each other?" "Well, anyway," said the Traveling Salesman stubbornly, "I'm going to walk out slow behind you and see you through this thing all right." "Oh, no, you're not!" exclaimed the Youngish Girl. "Oh, no, you're not! Can't you see that if he's there I wouldn't mind you so much? But if he doesn't come, can't you understand that maybe I'd just as soon you didn't know about it?" "Oh!" said the Traveling Salesman. A little impatiently he turned and routed the Young Electrician out of his sprawling nap. "Don't you know Boston when you see it?" he cried a trifle testily. For an instant the Young Electrician's sleepy eyes stared dully into the girl's excited face. Then he stumbled up a bit awkwardly and reached out for all his coil boxes and insulators. "Good night to you. Much obliged to you," he nodded amiably. A moment later he and the Traveling Salesman were forging their way ahead through the crowded aisle. Like the transient, impersonal, altogether mysterious stimulant of a strain of martial music, the Young Electrician vanished into space. But just at the edge of the car steps the Traveling Salesman dallied a second to wait for the Youngish Girl. "Say," he said, "say, can I tell my wife what you've told me?" "Yes," nodded the Youngish Girl soberly. "And say," said the Traveling Salesman, "say, I don't exactly like to go off this way and never know at all how it all came out." Casually his eyes fell on the big lynx muff in the Youngish Girl's hands. "Say," he said, "if I promise honest Injun to go way off to the other end of the station, couldn't you just lift your muff up high once if everything comes out the way you want it?" "Yes," whispered the Youngish Girl almost inaudibly. Then the Traveling Salesman went hurrying on to join the Young Electrician, and the Youngish Girl lagged along on the rear edge of the crowd like a bashful child dragging on the skirts of its mother. Out of the groups of impatient people that flanked the track she saw a dozen little pecking reunions, where some one dashed wildly into the long narrow stream of travelers and yanked out his special friend or relative like a good-natured bird of prey. She saw a tired, worn, patient-looking woman step forward with four noisy little boys and then stand dully waiting while the Young Electrician gathered his riotous offspring to his breast. She saw the Traveling Salesman grin like a bashful schoolboy just as a red-cloaked girl came running to him and bore him off triumphantly toward the street. And then suddenly out of the blur and the dust and the dizziness and the half-blinding glare of lights the figure of a man loomed up directly and indomitably across the Youngish Girl's path. A man standing bareheaded and faintly smiling as one who welcomes a much revered guest. A man, tall, stalwart, sober-eyed, with a touch of gray at his temples. A man whom many women would be proud to have waiting for her at the end of any journey. And right there, before all that hurrying, scurrying, self-centered, unseeing crowd, he reached out his hands to her and gathered her frightened fingers close into his. "You've kept me waiting a long time," he reproached her. "Yes," she stammered. "Yes, yes. The train was 2 hours late." "It wasn't the hours that I was thinking about," said the man very quietly. "It was the year." And then just as suddenly the Youngish Girl felt a tug at her coat, and turning round quickly found herself staring with dazed eyes into the eager, childish face of the Traveling Salesman's red-cloaked wife. Not 30 feet away from her the Traveling Salesman's shameless, stolid-looking back seemed to be blocking up the main exit to the street. "Oh, are you the lady from British Columbia?" queried the excited little voice. Perplexity, amusement.